like to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Business School Student Leadership and Ethics Board and the CEPA's Center on Global Energy Policy. We're excited to have Greg Zuckerman from the Wall Street Journal here tonight to talk about his new book, The Frackers, the outrageous inside story of the new Billionaire Wildcatters. There's been pretty strong interest in this from the Columbia community, as you can see from this room, and it's a timely issue. I'd like to take a second to introduce both the organization sponsoring the event and then our distinguished moderator. First, the Student Leadership and Ethics Board, of which I'm a part, is at the Business School and housed in the Bernstein Center, seeks to foster a culture of principled leadership at Columbia Business School by organizing events focused on today's most relevant issues for policymakers and business leaders. In turn, the Center on Global Energy Policy at CEPA's mission is to provide independent, balanced, data-driven analysis to help policymakers navigate the complex world of energy. We're lucky to have our moderator this evening as the Center's director, Professor Jason Bordoff. Before arriving at Columbia last year, he served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change in the National Security Council, and prior to that held senior policy positions in the White House's National Economic Council and the Council on Environmental Quality. Before joining the White House, he was the Policy Director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution. He also served as advisor to the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury during the Clinton administration and worked at McKinsey & Company. With that, I'd like to turn it over, thank you all again for coming, and turn it over to Professor Bordoff. You can introduce Greg. Yeah, here you go.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all of you for coming, and thanks, Greg, for being here, and most of all for writing this book. I think what we're going to do is have a little bit of a conversation up here for a half hour or so, and then spend about a half hour just taking your questions and passing the microphone around. It's not that large a room, so we can have it sort of be somewhat informal. I had your bio, and I forgot it, but then I realized I have it right here. So right in here. Greg Zuckerman is a special writer at the Wall Street Journal and best-selling author of The Greatest Trade Ever, a two-time winner of the Gerald Loeb Award, a winner of the New York Press Club Journalism Award. Lives in New Jersey with his wife and two sons. So your bio's right, and your pictures.
Yeah,
here
that's all you need.
Proof. And you broke the story on the London whale and J.P. Morgan, and so maybe we'll start sort of there with that. That's your career. You've been a very distinguished financial and business journalist. Why write this book about fracking?
Right. So, hi everyone. Thanks for everyone being here, everyone's attention. Thank you for my colleague, who I'm sure when I forget something or don't know something, he'll know the answer. So he's a font of knowledge. So I appreciate you taking the time tonight. So yeah, I've been at the Wall Street Journal since 1996. I've covered a lot of hardcore financial topics: markets, traders, investors, hedge funds, private equity, global markets, that kind of stuff. But it hit me about, I don't know, 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, that the most interesting and important topic, business topic, today is this revolution going on in our nation's energy fields. And as a writer, I look for certain things to get me excited, and for books and that kind of thing. But often, I'm a sports guy, and I look for home runs and strikeouts. Firms and individuals making huge mistakes, firms kind of collapsing, and why that happened, and people doing huge home runs, getting it right, changing things. And there's a lot of drama, I think, in these kind of home runs and strikeout kind of stories, and a lot of lessons that can be learned for the reader as well. So I kind of embrace those, and it struck me that this is a huge topic. It's meaty. It's going to impact both the United States, it already is, and the world. And it's also something of a David and Goliath story, and I'm also partial to those themes. Because there's a paradox behind this whole era, and frankly, behind my last book too, which was about the financial collapse, in that the people that got it right, the people that led this revolution, the pioneers, aren't the people you would have expected, just like the people that anticipated the financial meltdown a few years ago were the very last people you would have expected. So I am partial to that theme as well, all the reasons I kind of threw myself into it.
And tell us a little bit, just some color about sort of what the experience was like. I've spent some time in the oil patch and in shale formations and in Houston. Whenever I'm there, I'm a Jewish kid from Brooklyn. There's not a ton of other people sort of with that profile. And I mean, your background is a little different. Just what was the sort of experience like with spending as much time as you did there?
Yeah, so I had the real privilege of getting out there and going to Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and Texas, and Louisiana, and Oklahoma, places I'd never been often, and it was an eye-opener in a lot of different ways. In some ways, it was very reassuring about our nation's future, and in other ways disturbing, but it did bring home the fact that it's somewhat cliched, but we're much more similar than you would think. So I'm going to give you one quick little anecdote. I was in Nixon, Texas, population 1,500, and they have one stoplight and no movie theaters, and I was interviewing a guy named Buck Butler, who I begin my book with, and he's just a great guy who spent his life, I sat and met with him, and he said he runs a sale barn, and for about half an hour, between the accent and this new lingo, I'm like, what is a sale barn? Then I realized it's a barn where they auction cattle. And he, instead of doing what most people do in this country, when you have a little extra cash, you put it in the stock market or you save it or something, he bought acreage. There's something very Texas about that, and independent, and didn't believe in other kind of things. He wanted to buy acreage, and it drove his wife crazy. She was up all night because they had a lot of debt. Their business wasn't doing very well, and they literally owed millions of dollars. And then lo and behold, it turns out they were sitting on this formation called the Eagleford, which was packed with oil, and overnight almost they went from owing millions to being worth about $30–40 million, and everything changed. So I spent some time with him, and I write about him in the book, and I wanted to take a picture. So in his office, he's got his daughter-in-law working there and his son. So I gave my BlackBerry to the daughter-in-law to say, hey, do you mind taking a picture? I put my arms around each of them, and she struggled to take the photo. And I came around 3 times. I came around and said, don't worry, let me show you how to do it. This is how you do it. You press the button here. I'm thinking, I'm in old Texas here. I can't take a picture. So finally, the 3rd time, she finally gets it right, and she says, it's just so different from my iPhone. And here's the picture right there. And like the joke's on me, city slicker, being judgmental. I've got the BlackBerry. She's got the new iPhone. So in some ways, we're much more similar than you would think. And again, it's been very eye-opening and reassuring in some ways about the nation's future.
I should share with everyone the most important thing about you, which I made a little joke about my background. And people say, why are you interested in energy? And the interest came from having studied Middle East politics as an undergraduate at Brown, with the guru of Middle East politics at Brown and one of the best professors there, Alan Zuckerman, your dad. So an indirect reason why I'm doing what I'm doing today.
Nice.
I just want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the characters in the book, because they are so extraordinary. So let's sort of take them in order, I guess.
Sure.
Who
so
is George Mitchell?
George Mitchell, we'll start with. So I'll take a step back. I had suggested earlier that the people that led this revolution are sort of the last people you would have expected. Who should have led this revolution? So it should have been ExxonMobil, right? Biggest energy company in the world. ExxonMobil's headquarters literally are on top of the Barnett Shale, which is this formation in Texas, which is sort of ground zero for this whole resurgence. And literally, their headquarters are in Irvine, Texas. And yet, Exxon was going anywhere but America to drill. They were going offshore. They were going to Africa. They were going to Asia. They couldn't care less about America. So Exxon blew it. Chevron blew it. Chevron had, and I write about it in my book, they had a group in the early 1980s they started to do unconventional drilling. And that's what this whole revolution is about. Unconventional drilling just means not just plain vertical. It means horizontal, which we've developed as a country. To do vertical, then you turn the drill bit 90 degrees, you go horizontal, and to drill in things like shale and some challenging formations, types of rock. So that they were early, and yet they started this group, and they had some talented people there, and they couldn't pull it off. People elsewhere in the company undermined them, made fun of them, poached talent from the group. They couldn't pull it off. BP, all the experts got it wrong. Even the investors on Wall Street. In 2007, the biggest leverage buyout in history was pulled off. It was TXU, which was a utility, and it was a bet on rising natural gas prices. And who did that bet? It was KKR, it was TPG, it was Goldman Sachs, it was Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett bought up the debt of this TXU, and they all got it wrong. They all expected that we were running out as a nation, we were running out of natural gas and oil, and hence natural gas prices were going to go higher. So they all got it wrong. All the experts got it wrong. Peak oil there were books upon books written. So who got it right? So George Mitchell is the first guy to lead. He's the key guy who began this revolution. George Mitchell was a mid-sized natural gas producer in Texas. He's the son of a Greek goat herd. Poor guy came over here from, they took him off the boat at Ellis Island, and they started working, building the rail system of this country. His name actually was Savas Paraskopoulos. I knew I was going to butcher it. And one day his paymaster came to him and said, "Savas, I can't spell this name. What's with the name here?" And Savas said, "Well, what's your name?" He said, "My name is Mike Mitchell." And he said, "All right, I'll be Mike Mitchell." So he became Mike Mitchell, and his son is George Mitchell. And actually, when I went and talked to George Mitchell in Houston in his boardroom, we bonded a little bit over that story because my own great-grandfather got off the boat, and they said, "What's your name?" He said, "Rumshinsky," and they said, "We can't spell that. Take the last guy." It was Zuckerman. So I could have been O'Brien or something easy, but instead, so we had a similar kind of story. So George Mitchell ran this mid-sized natural gas company in Texas, and by the early 1980s, he saw the writing on the wall, and they were running out of natural gas. And they didn't have offshore in Asia and Africa like Exxon. They only had this formation. They were sitting on top of this different formations. They drilled in some, and they said, and George Mitchell said, "Well, let's try shale." And all the experts said, you don't want to be drilling in shale. Shale is the source rock. It's where oil and gas is born, and over millions of years goes closer to the surface. And then for years we've drilled down vertically and tried to get at the reservoirs. But we all knew there was a lot of oil and gas packed in shale, both in Texas but elsewhere around the country and the world. But the conventional wisdom is you don't want to waste your time trying to drill there because it's really expensive. It's deep in the ground. It's tough to get out. Shale is a very compressed rock. It looks a little bit like tombstone. I call it tombstone rock. And so everyone said, George, why? His colleague said, let's not waste our time there. But Mitchell didn't have a choice, right? So he said to his guys, he started a group, and he said, guys, let's figure it out. So by 1997, they were close to giving up. By then, George Mitchell was close to 80. He had cancer. His wife had early Alzheimer's. His own heir apparent, Bill Stevens, didn't believe in what they were doing, and behind Mitchell's back, and Mitchell wasn't really day-to-day running things anymore, and Stevens was, and he was telling guys in that group, stop wasting your time. It's enough for this shale drilling. It's a waste of money. But a few guys kept at it. And my book is very much an American book. It's a book of persistence and obstinance and stubbornness. And these guys kept working at it. And finally, one day, they had a lucky break, and it was very much lucky. They were drilling. They were fracking. So I bet half this room knows very well what fracking is. The other half probably doesn't. I'll just simplify it. Fracking basically means pummeling rock, often this kind of difficult rock like shale, with a cocktail of liquids. Chemicals and water and sand, and they were using this foam kind of material back then. But one day, their contractor, I think it was Halliburton, I write about it in the book, they made a mistake and they used much too much water in the process. And this guy, Nick Steinsberger, was like 32, and he was the head engineer of in that group there. He said he saw they were getting pretty good amounts of natural gas from this water heavy cocktail of liquids, and he said, "Okay, let's keep working it. Let's play with it. Let's improve on it, and trial and error kind of thing." And everyone said, "What are you talking about? It was a one-off thing. It was a fluke. Yeah, you got some pretty good amount of natural gas, but nothing special here. Give up." But Steinsberg at that point was really looking to, this is sort of his last shot. I mean, back then in the late 90s, no one wanted to be the energy industry. Everyone think it was about, it's a little bit like today in terms of tech being really hot. Energy is also hot now, but back then no one wanted to be in energy. So he knew this was his last shot to stay in the industry and to have a job, and his wife was ready to leave. So basically they worked at it and they made it happen. In that year, 1998, they finally figured out the right combination of chemicals and water and sand. It's mostly water. That's why it's called slick water, is the concoction, what they called it. And they showed you can get a good amount, a really large amount of natural gas from shale. And Mitchell sold his company, walked away with over $2 billion. These other guys didn't really get rewarded that much, and partly I try to give them credit in the book. But they figured it out. And that was the first step in this whole revolution. Again, it was a guy named George Mitchell. It wasn't Exxon. But everyone at the time said, okay, Mitchell, good job. In Texas, you figured it out. But who's to say you can get shale gas elsewhere in the country, or oil for that matter? So it took other people to do that.
And you didn't mention the government. government officials, you'll often hear claims will say it was government R&D in the 1970s that helped all of this happen. Industry tends to dismiss that claim somewhat. So I'm curious your take on that from all the looking into this you did.
That's a good question. So both sides sort of exaggerate, as is the case often in this debate, the fracking debate. We'll get to the environmental sides. That's sort of my contention when it comes to the environmental aspects too. The government played a role in fracking, actually played a much bigger role in horizontal drilling. So the patent for horizontal drilling, the guys that developed it were two guys working for the government, and they get a lot of credit. They should get a lot of credit. And horizontal drilling is just as important as fracking in this whole resurgence. Doesn't get as much ink because fracking's a little sexier and more controversial, but horizontal drilling the government does get credit for. The government subsidized and helped Mitchell to some extent, but it was early and it was nothing in the Barnett area. So the Mitchell guys say they did it themselves. They got a little help from the government, but not as much as those working on horizontal drilling.
And you mentioned the environmental concerns. Obviously, it's very contentious and controversial, fracking. Many of you may have seen last week a new study that came out that reported methane emissions that may be higher than some people had thought they would be, work that was funded by George Mitchell's foundation. So actually interested if you could kind of, as a segue into the environmental thing, talk a little bit about, and later in life, how George Mitchell came to view the unconventional gas revolution and to what, how he understood the risks and the benefits, what his foundation does, and then sort of talk a little bit about how you view the environmental issues.
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy because he was always very focused on resources and running out of resources and alternatives. You can blame him for being the father of fracking, and he is, but his foundation is really focused on alternatives and next generation. And all of his kids, I've met a bunch of them, none of them are, there's only one that's sort of a wildcatter, and even he in my book, I quote him saying that his father will be remembered if we can transition to an era of alternatives, and that's my hope and that's my belief, then his father will be remembered fondly, but if not, if we're further addicted to fossil fuels, then his own father, he says, will be blamed years from now. History will determine. So he's a fascinating guy. And in terms of the environmental side, I mean, we don't have enough time for me to kind of really go on, but I'll really boil it down to my view. So again, my view is that both sides really overstate the argument. First, I'll tell you why the environmentalists overstate things. So, they kind of say fracking poisons. The three key, or I'll get to another one after, three key concerns are methane in water, and we've all seen kind of movies where you turn on the faucet and you light a match and there's a fireball. Chemicals getting into our drinking water, and earthquakes or tremors. I'll go each of those quickly. When it comes to methane in the water, it does happen. The problem is determining why it happens, and often, if not usually, it's naturally, methane naturally gets into the water. And how do I know that? Besides talking to scientists, which I did, I traveled to these areas and I went and I talked to some old timers, and I spoke to somebody in Dimick. Dimick is sort of ground zero for the protests in Pennsylvania. They said, Greg, and this is sort of an old timer, they said, Greg, we went to school, when we were growing up, we'd go to school early, turn on the faucet, light a match, and run for it. And it blew up. Native Americans used to light the water on fire. There are 3 towns in this country named Burning Springs. There's Burning Springs, New York, Burning Springs, Kentucky, and a Burning Springs, I forget, but it's in my book. So in other words, naturally, methane, sometimes because they're in shallow formations, close to the ground, methane gets into the water, and hence you can light a match and blow it up. Now, sometimes methane, it results from fracking or drilling in general. It's not just fracking, and that's because there are mistakes made. And we'll get to those mistakes and why the industry overstates things in a minute. So, but generally speaking, I'm not worried about fracking causing methane to get into the water. And the next question is about chemicals, because some of these chemicals used aren't those that we want to ingest. Some of them are carcinogens, and they're just unhealthy. And when you talk to scientists, they say it's possible that the chemicals will get into the water, but it's unlikely. And that's largely because we're drilling so far down relative to where the water table is, the reservoirs. We're drilling as much as 14,000 feet below in some areas, and the water is often 400 feet below. So assuming, and this is an assumption, assuming the casing around the wells holds, then you're very unlikely to get chemicals somehow magically going up that far and getting into the water. And the third issue are these tremors or earthquakes we've seen here and there. And that's not from fracking per se, that's from injecting the wastewater afterwards. And it's troublesome. Most of these you don't feel. These tremors, they're not large enough to be felt. But it's an issue of injection, and the industry is doing a better job of figuring out the geology of where they're injecting this stuff. They're also doing a better job of recycling, so we won't have to inject as much. So I'm not as concerned about, so I'm not especially concerned about those three issues. Then the key other one is methane leakage. Cut me off anytime you want, or ask me. So methane, so natural gas is generally better than coal, or we think it is, we hope it is, we believe it is. And that's only if not so much methane is leaked during the production and during the delivery pipelines and such of natural gas. If we leak too much methane, methane is a greenhouse gas, and that makes it worse. That would make natural gas worse than coal. So all this natural gas, this whole era has actually been very helpful to the United States. Our carbon dioxide emissions are down to 1994 levels. We're actually compliant with Kyoto. We scoffed at Kyoto. We made fun of Kyoto, and we're compliant. And I came back from London like a month or two ago, and they are literally importing our coal, our dirty coal. We're sending coal to Newcastle. I mean, believe it or not. And they're addicted to our coal because they aren't fracking. They are still, they're pushing more into natural gas, and so are a lot of other countries. I mean, China, the only way we make a dent into global warming is to get China to stop being so addicted to coal. So our countries actually, we've reduced our carbon dioxide and we've become more compliant with Kyoto, et cetera. And that's because we've shifted our reliance from coal at the margin to natural gas. I think it's the numbers I had last seen are instead of we're up down to 36% of power coming from coal, as opposed to about 51% before this whole era. So yeah, we've improved a lot, and natural gas is better than coal, but that's only if we don't emit so much methane, which is, again, greenhouse gas. We don't emit so much methane that it hurts, it accelerates global warming, and in effect, makes natural gas worse than coal. So if you talk to most scientists, and including this study, even the study said that net natural gas is still better than coal. And despite the leaks of methane, we've made improvements by shifting from coal to natural gas thanks to fracking and horizontal drilling in this whole era. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we've improved the environment thanks to this era. The key here, of course, is not to get addicted to fossil fuels, and we can talk about that as well. Now let me talk about why the industry overstates things. So sadly, it's sort of fracking poisons or drill, baby, drill. And these guys overstate their case because they make mistakes all the time. There are leaks, there's pollution, air pollution, there's the trucks, and it changes. It changes the complexion of small towns. The casing. Remember I said that the casing has to hold. It doesn't always hold. I've seen different data, but 1 in 10 times it has to be remediated, however one defines that. So my big argument has been, and it's shared by guys like Environmental Defense Fund, and they get flack from the left. My argument is that we're going to be fracking and we're going to be drilling for oil and gas in this country. Let's put more pressure on the drillers, on the producers, so that they improve the way they do it. Fracking can be done properly and largely can be safe. It can be done safely, but only if we put more pressure on the companies to improve the way they operate, as opposed to just condemning them and wishing they'd go away, and they're not going away.
So we'll come back to that. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that particular piece of it. But I want to give you a chance to talk just for a couple more minutes before we open up for questions about the book and some of the characters in here. We don't have to go through all 6, but maybe 1 or 2 more that you think are most colorful. In particular, I was sort of interested in the fact that you had, the whole book is people who saw an energy boom coming that no one else saw, and just every couple of pages, it seems like one of them, you sort of have an italics when someone's thinking something in their head. They're thinking like, why is no one else seeing what I'm seeing? Except one person who saw a shortage coming, which was Sharif Suki. And so I'm wondering why he's in the book.
And I think he went to Columbia Business School, did he?
He did.
Yeah, there you go. A local flavor. Sharif Suki isn't a wildcatter, but I put him on my book for a bunch of reasons, but he's a fascinating guy. I'm really attracted just to complex, gray characters. Some people hate him, some people love him. Depends, everyone comes away with a different view of these guys after, but they have changed the country and the world. So Sharif Suki was an investment banker for many years, made a lot of money, went off to Colorado to ski with his family and ran out of money. And then he started some restaurants, some bars. He owned the Mezzaluna restaurant in Los Angeles. Anyone know what that's famous for? Young people won't remember. There you go. Who got that? Very good, young guy. So he owned the restaurant where Nicole Brown Simpson was the night she was murdered, and Ron Goldman worked there. And it became like a tourist trap afterwards, and it disgusted Sharif because tourists would come and they'd steal spoons and plates, and it was gruesome, and he got disgusted by the whole thing, and he said, all right, I got to find a new job, right? And he didn't know anything about energy. I joked that he knew more about fajitas than fracking. But he was a really, really smart guy and a persuasive guy, and he read what all the experts were saying, and all the experts said we were running out of natural gas in this country. So what do you do? Well, he said, I'm going to start a company to build terminals to import natural gas or liquefied natural gas and convert it into natural gas into this country because we're going to need it, right? And for a while, he was doing really well. This company, Cheniere, the stock was going up. He was worth a lot of money. And then around 2006 or so, 2007, it dawned on him what was going on in this country. Wait, hold on a second. We're actually not going to be desperate for natural gas. A glut was developing, and his stock started tumbling, and he had been wealthy, and he lost almost all of it, and he was really in trouble. And his own investors just completely gave up on him. And he kept saying, it's a real story. He's an immigrant from Lebanon. Did I mention that? He's an immigrant from Lebanon. So there are a lot of immigrants in my book. It's a very, again, American story, and it's a story of persistence. And he sort of rope-a-doped for a while, and he said to his board, I'll figure something out. And they're like, well, Sharif, what are you going to do? I'll figure something out. And he didn't really know what to do. But it dawned on him, and he's like, wait, hold on a second. If everyone's saying everyone's saying there's going to be a glut in this country, and it looks like there's going to be a glut. Maybe instead of importing natural gas, we should export natural gas. And if you think about it, it's pretty gutsy on his part because he had to go to his investors and say, you know how a couple years ago I convinced you guys we were running out of natural gas in this country? Well, actually, we've got a glut coming, and we should export it. And it's, again, they just literally his company had borrowed billions of dollars, and now he wanted billions more to refit his terminals so they could export it. And it was at that point they'd already given up on him anyway. So they were like, whatever you want, go for it, Sharif, give it a shot, because they'd written off this investment and it helped him actually. But he figured it out, and he got the approvals from the government before anybody else was even thinking about exporting LNG. He figured out how to do it. He borrowed even more billions of dollars. And his company is going to be the first one in the lower states to export natural gas. And the stocks, he's worth about $350 million today. So it's a real story of persistence and a guy kind of caught up in this whole era. He's not a wildcatter. I can talk about another wildcatter if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Harold
Hamm, sure. So Harold Hamm is another key guy in my book.
And with him, I'm sort of curious, like everyone else talk a lot about shale gas, but was it obvious that this same technology would be applied to oil, or was there something even more unique and visionary about what Harold did?
So the answer to that quickly is that at first people grudgingly said, all right, maybe you can get natural gas from shale, this rock, but oil is even harder to get out of shale. So people kind of dismissed that possibility. But this guy Harold Hamm believed. So Harold Hamm is a fascinating guy. He won't speak to me anymore, but that's besides the point. A lot of these guys won't. It's weird. My last book also. Anyway, I can get into why later. But Harold Hamm, I love him anyway. He's one of 13 children, dirt poor, little town in Oklahoma. The first pair of new shoes he ever had was when his little shack of a home burned down, and it became like a great day for him because people in town pitched in and bought him a new pair of shoes. He couldn't even go to school each year till around Christmas time because he had to help his parents, who were sharecroppers in the fields. They picked cotton and watermelon. So he didn't go to college, but he had this hunger to find oil, and it's a real sort of a American archetype. So there were some oil guys, local wildcatters, that he looked up to, and he saw that they were doing pretty well, and he said, hey, maybe I could do that, and I'm going to go find oil. But again, he wasn't a geologist or an engineer, or didn't even go to college. So he started off starting a company to clean out oil tankers. He literally took a long rake and he cleaned out like the sediment and the muck at the bottom of the tankers, and he started transporting water. He saved some money and he started wildcatting, betting on areas in Oklahoma and finding oil. And he taught himself geology at night and took courses and stuff and read books. And he built up a little company. Then he headed up north. He said, I'm going to go up to Montana. Then eventually they went into North Dakota. Now, those were always really boom and bust areas historically. Everyone knew there was a lot of oil up there in these kind of deeper formations, challenging formations. But once again, people kind of said, don't waste your time, Harold, because these are challenging this limestone there and shale, and it's challenging rock, and people hadn't figured out how to do it. But they kept plugging away, and they were not the first ones. They were sort of fast followers. A few of my guys in my book are, this is a good lesson for business school guys here. He was a fast follower. He saw that people were combining the horizontal drilling with fracking, and they were doing it in stages, this fracking. So I'll write about it in the book, but it's not so complicated. You isolate parts, and you can focus on it a little bit better, the fracking, the wellbore. Anyway, so they were early, and they leased up a lot of land. He had a real remarkable self-confidence, Hamm, that he was going to make it, and he was going to find a lot of oil. But by 2006 or so, they really hadn't produced much oil from this area. It's called the Bakken. He tried to sell his acreage. No one wanted it. Again, the big guys kind of dismissed what he was doing, but kind of trial and error. They kept at it. They figured out how to innovate and how to improve the way they got out. I mean, this is really a story of technology. It's not really an energy. I mean, it's an energy story, but it's as much a story about technology and how America really leads the rest of the world in innovating. And they were innovative. And they figured it out, and they produced a lot of oil over just the last few years. This burst of oil from the Bakken area partly comes from Continental Resources, his company, and he's the largest holder. And he's so wealthy now. Again, he started off so dirt poor as I described. Today he's worth $14.5 billion. He's worth more than the estate of Steve Jobs. He's so wealthy. He's unfortunately going through a divorce right now. But rumors he's got a new girlfriend. Don't worry. His wife, though, is going to walk away with more money than Oprah Winfrey. So he's a real rags to riches kind of story, and it's all from innovation in these fields.
So, and you talk in the book about how fundamentally this has changed the U.S. energy outlook. I mean, just a handful of years ago, imports rising, production declining. Last year, just as a data point, the U.S. enjoyed the second highest annual increase in oil production of any country in history. Only Saudi Arabia in 1973, aside from when they pulled out from their spare capacity. But an organic increase in production, only one time in history has a country seen a larger increase in oil production. So fundamentally changed the outlook. You talk about why it wasn't the big companies. It was small entrepreneurs and independent guys who made this happen. When you look at the predictions now, the International Energy Agency shows, U.S. production continues to rise, and how long that goes on kind of gets pushed out further and further, and then it plateaus. But they don't see it happening anywhere else in the world. And so having looked as closely as you did at what it took for that to happen in the U.S. and the fact that it wasn't big companies, certainly not state-owned companies, it was small independents, now that we know how to do this, is there a reason to be that pessimistic? From what you've learned, what do you think the outlook is for this kind of production elsewhere?
So yeah, first off, as Jason knows as well as I do, we can go on and on about the impact of this country. There are jobs. We pay natural gas prices that are about a third to a half of what they do in Europe and Asia. There are geopolitical impacts, I really believe, and I can talk about a little bit further, but people are starting to understand some of the geopolitical impacts and think about what's going to happen going forward. I think one of the reasons why we didn't get involved in Syria a few months ago, despite Saudi Arabia pleading with us, was because we don't care as much about what the Saudis think, and that's going to happen going forward. I think maybe what Kerry's doing in the Middle East right now is a last gasp, and we're going to care a lot less for other reasons too, but at the margin, we're going to care less about the Middle East. We're always going to care. The Middle East has oil, and as long as oil is important, and we have allies. But at the margin, we're going to care less, especially if Hillary wins, and because she was the architect a few years ago in the State Department of this pivot to Asia, and they've reduced some of the spending and some of the presence in the Strait of Hormuz, that kind of thing. So the geopolitical impacts, the economic impacts are dramatic. And to get to your question, when I first started this project, I really thought that this was the first chapter. America was the first chapter. And then clearly other countries would be hot on our heels because they've got as much, if not more, shale oil and gas than we do. Argentina, Mexico, the UK, Poland, China, Russia, etc. But the more work I did in it, I now believe they will catch up, but it's going to take a lot longer than I'd expected. We've got a whole list of advantages over the rest of the world. We have better access to fresh water, not as much as we would like, but better than they do. We've got a pipeline system. We've got mapped out geology that they don't have. We've got formations that are actually a little bit higher in the ground than some places like China. We've got entrepreneurs. So this is a story of entrepreneurs risking it all. And some pull it off and some don't. I write about both. But at the heart, I really think you need risk takers. And you need the reward system that we have here. You know, the inequality, income inequality in this country is very troubling, but we still have incentives for people to do remarkable things in a lot of different areas, and you need that capital markets allocation. And we also have individuals own our land rights in this country, unlike almost every other country. So I was in London, and you can make the argument, there's a really cogent argument to me that they should start fracking. North Sea is dropping. They're importing our coal, as I said, which is crazy, and it's not good for the environment. But you know, if you're in a part of the country where they're going to start drilling, and you're not going to be rewarded because the crown owns the land under your home and your farm, as opposed to in America where individuals are being compensated and some getting wealthy, it's much harder to make that argument. Now the government officials in England say we are gonna shift money back into those communities from this production. You know, remains to be seen. But we've got dramatic advantages over the rest of the world that will keep us in the lead for foreseeable future.
So the difficulty of doing this overseas is one thing that surprised you. What's something else? What's the thing that most surprised you from what you expected in writing the book?
Well, I went into the project, had this image of the frackers. I sort of pictured like these Houston boardroom guys chomping on cigars and started giggling their way to the bank. You know, I spilled. Oh well, you know, I spilled. What can I do? Kind of thing. But when you talk to these guys, you know, they're not angels, but a lot of them are geologists. They like rock. They hunt, they fish. They're outside more than I am. You know, I'm at my desk most of the day. They don't want to hurt the environment. They don't want to harm the environment. They often do. They're not angels, but they're not out. They're not callous, and they know they've got horrible PR, and they want to improve. I'm sort of surprised by that, but maybe that's just sort of my bias. I guess. I was very reassured about the future of this country in that when you get away from the coasts, you get young people who are finding jobs and turning around their lives. They have. I was in Williston, North Dakota. Has anyone been to Williston by any chance? It's one of the most fascinating places, right? It's just one of those fascinating places I've ever been to. It's like a magnet for capitalism. You have people from all over the world that are coming there, and it's not. The only reason you're there is to make money because it's really hot and ugly and dirty in the summer, and it's unbelievably cold in the winter. But they're there to turn their lives around. There are people moving from like Oregon over and Pennsylvania. They get in trucks. A lot of them don't want to be on the dole. They don't have debt. And I give them a lot of credit. They're working really harsh conditions. And sometimes they go up there for 3 weeks and come back home for a week. But there are young people and there are others who have jobs. It's 3% unemployment there, 3% unemployment in the Permian Basin. I met a kid in Louisiana who's making over $100,000 a year and without a college education. So in some ways, it's very reassuring about the country and the future and how we innovate and we continue to innovate. But it's also very troubling because like any other topic of importance in this country, we're so split and there are very few people willing to meet in the middle. And I've gotten criticized from both sides. And again, some of the frackers won't talk to me anymore for various reasons. And the others left also isn't thrilled that I embrace this bridge, this theme. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm naive, but I am very hopeful that allows us to bridge to the alternatives. But it was troubling to me that we don't have as many people in the center and people willing to work with the energy companies and put pressure on the energy companies. This EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, does, and they get a lot of criticism from the left. So in some ways, it was troubling for me.
So we have about 25 minutes for questions. Let's open it up, and then how do you want to do this? Do you want to? Okay, cool, thanks. So please just introduce yourself and keep the questions brief.
Hi, my name is Judith O'Neill. I chair the Energy Committee at AJC. I'm actually on Harold's board at the Council for Secure America. He is the 13th of those 13 children, and he's gotten a lot of criticism his whole life, so he doesn't react so well to it. He doesn't talk to a lot of
That's
people.
good. That's good. That's good. Yeah, he's a sensitive guy. Yeah.
Very sensitive, but incredible. I mean, he literally developed Bakken almost by himself with continents. I have two questions, one Mexico and one upstate New York. In Mexico, the Congress very recently passed this opening up of Pemex, well, not of Pemex, but the liberalization of energy. They're 86% fossil fuel dependent, and it's been oil until now, and they opened it up based on fracking as a new technology. They will invite entrepreneurs to go in there. Because I'm on the board, on Harold's board and Council for a Secure America, it doesn't seem likely to me that the independent oil producers, the frackers, if you will, and they are the frackers, will kind of go into Mexico. They're very happy with what they're doing in the United States. They're getting very wealthy, as you pointed out, with what they're doing in the United States. So do you see the big companies going into Mexico to develop that as the, quote, entrepreneurs? And if they do that, do you think they're going to be as entrepreneurial as the 13th of 13 kids? And then the other question is, upstate New York, there are a couple of lawsuits going on right now with regard to whether or not local mayors of towns and townships should be allowed to ban fracking in different places. There are a bunch of legal issues on preemption, but fundamentally, since, as you point out, fracking is a phenomenon for the entire country, for our economy, for jobs, for the globe, actually. Do you have a point of view as to whether that should be controlled on a local basis versus a whole national picture?
So in terms of Mexico, there are some mid-sized guys who are excited about Mexico, partly because the geology isn't so dissimilar from Texas, and they know Texas and the Eagle Ford, those kind of areas. EOG is one company I write about. It's a company that used to be part of Enron, and they had no use for them because they were actually looking for oil and gas, not just trading it. And they were I write about in the book, they were one of the first people to get excited about the Eagle Ford area, and they leased up a lot of land. And they're among those who are interested in Mexico. But you're right that the smaller guys are sticking to America. That said, this age, so I talk about how Exxon and the other kind of people gave up on America. Well, around 2009 or so, they realized they made a mistake, and they came racing back to the country. So Exxon bought XTO, which was a pioneer, for about $41 billion. And so they are now in America too, among the people leading the charge and being the biggest producers, which I think is good because they're less likely to make dumb mistakes like some of the other people like Cabot and did in Pennsylvania. So Mexico, I don't know, I'm not an expert in Mexico. I don't want to pretend I am. So I know some people are excited about it. And in terms of New York State, listen, apparently, Governor Cuomo is more comfortable with gambling than with fracking, because we were okay with that upstate, but fracking not. Listen, I'm sympathetic to local communities, beautiful parts of the country there, obviously, in the state. They want to ban it. They don't have a need for it. And others need the jobs and are distressed areas I've visited up there, and they want to see it happen. So I'm in favor of allowing them based on the science. I mean, the science elsewhere seems to suggest it can be done safely. So I'm not sure why it couldn't be done safely in those communities that want to do it in New York. But I don't think it should be forced down anyone's throat there either. Cooperstown or something.
Michael Bloom, former energy specialist at the United Nations. I think one of the issues that is retarding the development of shale gas in Europe has been the strong environmental voice that the United States has now transmitted there, so that you have a lot of people against it in England and France, which have very promising prospects, and so development there has been retarded. And the reason I want to point that out is because I think the fact that independents were the first to develop this goes hand in hand with the sort of, I think, well-known path that independents have trod, and that is they tend to shortcut because they have less finance, they have less risk. They're trying to get the job done as quickly as possible, make as much money as fast as possible. while the bigger companies have a PR perspective in mind also. So I think we've seen a higher, let's say, environmental degradation as a result of wells not being completed as well as they could have been, as they would have been, say, by the majors. And so instead of well, you mentioned pressuring the majors. Don't you think that we should be pressuring not so much the oil companies, but our political leaders, or in order to regulate those companies, independents as well as majors, so that things are done more safely, so that their resource can be developed?
For sure. So it is actually encouraging. There are 3 states recently that have taken some really nice steps. Colorado, into forcing companies to reduce the methane leakage. Others, Colorado and Wyoming has done its own water. California has taken some steps. Not sure why every state doesn't do it. So I'm sorry, Texas too. Colorado in particular, again, methane leakage is just key here. And what they're going to require drillers, companies to do isn't so drastic and so dramatic that we can't do it elsewhere. It's making sure that there are no leaks of methane going in there before, after, during, checking for that kind of stuff. It's really unclear to me why we can't do that elsewhere. But it is encouraging that at least some states are taking that step. So yeah, putting pressure on the government officials to create new laws, for sure. But I think they're hurting themselves, environmentalists, by just kind of protesting and saying fracking poisons, as opposed to saying they're going to do it. Let's make sure they do it properly and stop leaking so much and spilling and doing that kind of thing. And in terms of you had said about the environmentalists or the environmental damage early on, for sure, some of it was sloppiness, but also some of it was being in places that they knew nothing about, they didn't know enough about. So I know Cabot in Pennsylvania, that part of the country around Dimmock, where all the controversy was, that part of the state hadn't been drilled in years, if ever. Other parts of the state had, but they hadn't done much at all. They were not very familiar with the geology, and they made mistake after mistake early on. Not apologizing for them, I'm explaining what often happened. And I'm not suggesting that only the big guys should come under pressure now. For sure, everybody should, yeah. And just the first part you said about France and England, yeah, the environmental groups are stronger there. France, it's different because they are dependent on nuclear there. They've got nuclear power, which we as a country, for whatever reason, environmentalists don't like nuclear, they don't like fracking. Some don't like wind now because there's some reports, that kills birds, and there's some reports now people living near wind turbines are getting sick. And solar kills birds, and not everyone loves that. It's an eyesore and that kind of stuff. So anyway, the environmentalists in England, you're right, are stronger. And the frackers don't have as great an argument because of the land rights and that kind of stuff.
Hi, I'm Peter Kellerman. I'm a geologist here at Columbia University. I'm curious, I believe that some of the land positions that were taken in the Marcellus were pretty questionable in terms of the actual producibility of the rocks. And also the decline rate of wells has turned out to be pretty fast in some places. So I'm just wondering, I know we can potentially regulate and have people recycle their fracking fluid and the flowback. And I know that we can potentially regulate and force people to use the best cement available to reduce leak of hydrocarbon into the groundwater. But I'm just wondering, what percentage of wells that are currently operating are best practices profitable?
In other words, if we make them do things properly, well, it depends how you define that. I don't know. Depends. I've seen, so Apache is at the forefront of recycling water, and they, in the Permian Basin, they are able to recycle and use recycled water as opposed to fresh water, we didn't really talk much about the tremendous need for fresh water with these wells, as much as 2 to 5 million gallons per well. But Apache is starting to recycle, and I don't know why, and I think maybe you suggested as much, I don't know why we can't have rules, maybe over time, to enforce that on others. I guess you're suggesting the cost is too high. From the people I've talked to, they say that there is a higher cost, and there'll be some wells, some areas where it'll be too expensive to do, I don't want to call it best practice, but some things like recycling water. But the costs are coming down for some of these kind of things, and natural gas prices are a little bit higher now. So people seem okay, especially, and plus it's the bigger companies often doing it now. So ExxonMobil can afford a little bit more to pay a little bit more to do best practices. I hope that answers some of your questions. Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, it's not clear that it's causing earthquakes.
Well, I think a question would be whether it is inevitable that it needs to cause earthquakes, right? Or whether it can, but that's a separate point. I was going to say that the International Energy Agency in their Golden Rules for a Golden Age of Gas report estimated that in their best practice set of rules for shale gas development, an increase in well production of 7 to 9%. So I think it's consistent with the idea that it is more costly, but modestly so. And so there's no reason they can't all be done to whatever one thinks best practice levels are, assuming they're reasonable. The other thing to point out is there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what the production cost curve looks like. So some it's very low, some it's high, and about 60% of the gas we're getting today is associated gas that we're getting because people are drilling for liquids, with liquid prices being over $100. Well, not the price U.S. consumers are always, but producers are always getting. But
I might take the
I
prerogative.
told you it would be helpful having Jason here.
I might take one question actually with holding the mic for both of you. But I guess, Greg, in your experience talking to the frackers and folks, what's their expectation regarding future regulation on both a state and national level? And for Professor Bordoff, coming from Washington, what do you think the Obama administration's approach is, particularly from the EPA, to regulation?
Well, I'll answer that first. The frackers, the producers, the wildcatters, the billionaires I write about, they're always whining. They're always whining about the government. And Harold Hamm in particular, the guy made $14 billion over the last, 5 years or so, and he has the kind of the nerve to complain about Obama, which I think is inappropriate because he's done so well. And yeah, yes, we're not drilling on public lands, and yet we're moving towards energy independence. You know, we're up to about 8.5 million barrels a day, up from 5 just a few years ago. So we're doing fine. Could they be producing more? Yeah, possibly. So they do worry that there'll be regulation, more regulation, and they already say there's too much regulation, but I think it's overstated. The EPA really hasn't cracked down much at all. You could argue that they should have, they shouldn't have. They've deferred to the states, and the states haven't. And listen, there hasn't been any cases. There've been some stuff settled out of court, that kind of stuff, but there've been no cases to kind of prove that fracking, as a result, fracking per se, is harmful according to the EPA. Again, there are mistakes upon mistakes that they've made, casing, et cetera, but fracking can be done properly is the argument. So they do worry about regulation, but I think excessively so. Jason?
I want to give you the chance to, we have limited time with you, so I can, but I'll just briefly say, I think I agree with what you said. The EPA, the administration's view, in our system, states are the frontline regulators of the oil and gas industry. I think that's the approach the administration's taken. There are certain areas where they have responsibility by law to take various steps, and some that have been quite useful, like requiring green completion technologies to deal with methane emissions, which has helped bring the rate of emissions down a little bit. Rules they put out to try to show what best practices might look like on BLM, federal lands, and a few other things. But I think it is targeted, and for the most part, the view is to let states be the frontline regulators and fill in where necessary and where there's statutory responsibility. And I think part of that is the fact that the EPA's clear focus now in terms of political capital and putting a target on its back is saved for use of the Clean Air Act to regulate emissions from coal-fired power plants. I think that is the big elephant that everyone's focused on.
Brandon McReynolds, MBA student. Quick comment, I grew up in West Texas, and I can tell you from personal experience, over the Christmas break, I probably saw 35 different oil locations and natural gas locations, and they're literally beautiful compared to what I remember when I was a kid in terms of the appearance and the water tanks and that sort of thing. So here's my quick question. Did you run into any issues just in terms of the use of water, since fracking requires such an immense amount of water, and it oftentimes, where I grew up, I'm right over the Klein Shale formation, water's very scarce.
Yeah, well, water is an issue we just don't focus on enough in this country. It's very location specific. So there's some areas where water is not an issue whatsoever in this country, despite all the fracking going on in those regions. In other areas, Texas, I think Colorado as well, where it really is an issue, and it's become much more of an issue. That's why there's impetus by Apache and some other people. There are a few other people doing some interesting recycling work, so they're going to have to do more of that. And we have to have a national discussion about water. I mean, fracking uses a lot of water. So do golf courses, a remarkable amount of water. You know, we have to make a decision about allocation. The price isn't there. The cost isn't there for these guys. In some ways, we're subsidizing the energy producers because their access to water they're not paying as much as they could be. And same thing with agriculture. There's even more wasted there. So water is a huge issue. Maybe it's a bigger issue than all the other issues, the chemicals and the other things people pick on the frackers over. And we haven't had enough of a discussion as a country about our water.
Hi, I'm Ward Bortz, MBA student. So one of the interesting stories I thought in there was Aubrey McClendon, how he was CEO of the year when natural gas was at $8 and then goes down to $2, and all of a sudden he's horrible and he was over-levered. And in all your kind of dealings with executives and whatnot, it seems like a lot of times in your books you talk about guys who made humongous bets. And in the financial crisis, they were vilified, and here they're kind of being, you know, they've changed the world. What's your view on how much risk executives should take? Should you bet the farm and just hope to be right, or be a little bit more conservative?
That's a good question. I haven't had that question before. I think, yeah, you should bet the farm as long as you're about transparency, as long as your company, as long as your investors are aware of what you're doing and your board's aware of it, and as long as you're not doing other kinds of things. So Aubrey, it wasn't just about betting on natural gas. It was also about buying his map collection for $75 million in the teeth of the financial crisis. A bunch of other things I write about in my book. So, and Aubrey's a key part of my book. Listen, is that prudent to bet everything on it? No, but let's say you're a hedge fund manager and you've told your investors, I'm doing this, and your investors sign up for that, then I'm not sure why that's not appropriate. It's different when you're a publicly traded company. So Aubrey should have, and I think I write it in my book, he should have kept his company private. He shouldn't have been public. It's just very different. You can't do things like having the board map purchases and the bonus. He got a huge bonus after 2008 when the stock collapsed, and he got a margin call. I write about he's begging Goldman Sachs not to give him a margin call. So it wasn't the best year. I mean, in some ways he did some good things, but he got a huge bonus, and he sold his map collection and all that kind of stuff. So that's just inappropriate for a public company. Private company, you know, good for you. Do whatever you want as long as your investors are okay with it. So a lot of it's just what you're doing as a public fiduciary.
Hi, my name is Gloria Albasi, and I'm not actually a member of the Columbia community. I disagree with a number of things you said, but I don't want to be disrespectful. It's a privilege for me to be here. What I would like to say is oil, finite. Natural gas, finite. It took, what, millions? I'm sure the geologists have explained how long it took for them to develop in the earth. As an impartial reporter for one of the greatest financial news agencies in the world, will you consider writing a book on why it is so hard to get alternative energy off the ground now in this country, when under President Jimmy Carter we were the leaders in solar technology, and now it's Germany? I mean, have you considered perhaps applying a couple of years into writing in that area? Thank you.
Sure. And it's okay. You know, I like constructive criticism. I get some of my best story ideas. To answer your question, well, first of all, I was at the Milken Center a few weeks ago in Los Angeles, and someone said I need to do penance for what I've done, and I should write about the environmental guys. And listen, I write about characters. So characters doing really big things. That's what I do. So if they're interesting characters doing environmental stuff, you know, Elon Musk, that kind of thing, then I'm sorry. Alternative energy people. I'd love to write about those guys. I would love to write about the George Mitchell of alternatives. That, listen, guys, home runs and strikeouts. That'd be a huge home run. I'm encouraged about our future, and I totally agree with the argument. Okay, the risk is that we get addicted to fossil fuels, so we don't want that. If you believe in global warming, as I do, we really don't want to be addicted to fossil fuels. My belief and my hope, and feel free to call me naive, maybe I'm naive, we'll see. But when I talk to investors, top Wall Street kind of guys, who are the money behind this kind of stuff, they say, Greg, we're already down the road with alternatives, thanks to the pricing, because things got so expensive, 2007 or so, 2008, that so much money was invested that we're going to reap the benefits over the next few years. And it's all about things like batteries, because solar and wind are intermittent, right? So the only way we can do anything, that we can rely on them, is if we can have storage. And there are people, there are companies spending millions, the smartest guys in our country, working hard to make breakthroughs in things like batteries and storage. And why are they doing it? They believe in this country. They also want to get really, really rich, which is sort of like the guys in my book. And I'm betting on those guys, and I'm really hoping for those guys they can pull it off. And listen, if you think about it, solar and wind, we're more reliant on them, not less reliant, over the last few years, despite the resurgence of natural gas and oil in this country. So my hope is what the environmentalists hoped until just a few years ago. They all talked about how this would be a bridge fuel. Natural gas is a bridge fuel, and this age of natural gas and fracking is going to give us time, to buy us time, so we can do the research and we can become reliant on alternatives. And that's my belief. So I'm hoping that's the case. But I would love to write about those guys.
Bob Harris, Columbia alum. You mentioned the tremendous cost of water, the financial cost per well, and also, the tremendous amount of water that's used. And the diminishing, projection, we have a 10-year projection of the diminishing supply of water, not only in Pacific areas, but, overall in the United States. And you said that, we've avoided the discussion or the debate about the use of this water, this tremendous use of water. Couldn't the discussion, the debate, be ended very quickly, with maybe a 4 or 5 year cost-benefit study by Kinsey or Columbia University or something like this?
What would we do with the study? What do you mean?
A cost-benefit study of the water.
And then what do you do?
Well, we wouldn't have the answer then.
Okay.
To whether we should be using all this water or not.
Okay, then what would you do?
After that?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm in the real world. What would you do with the study at that point?
Well, that's the question. Yeah.
Okay, my hope is that the price of water adjusts and becomes more expensive, forcing these guys to recycle or to pay their fair share. I would rather bet on the Apaches of the world to figure out ways to recycle this water, so we're not as dependent. We don't use as much water. And as it becomes more problematic, I think there'll be more impetus for that, hopefully.
Hello, my name is Mikołaj Jasiak. I'm a Fulbright here from Poland. So my question regards my jurisdiction, my country, as ExxonMobil, Talisman, Mountain Oil, they withdrew after test drillings. And I would like to ask about your opinion about it and to confront it with the opinions back home. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Poland. That which I know is that they've got a lot of shale. It's been very frustrating to people. Some have pulled out. It's not clear to me if they pulled out because of the geology or the politics of it. No one wants to get Russia angry with them. So Poland, it's a very Western country today and close to us, and we're pulling for Poland. So a lot of the good guys in this world have shale, England and Argentina, Mexico. I guess Russia has it too, but China, however you define China, we want guys like Poland to make progress. So there are people, some of the big guys have pulled out, and I think part of it is geology, but part of it is politics. But there are some large guys who are still excited about it, so hopefully they can make it work.
So I'm certain there are people who agree and disagree with lots of what you said about how beneficial this is, how harmful it is, what the risks are. But it's happening, and it's a really extraordinary, whether you think it's good or bad, a pretty stunning turnaround from what everybody thought the U.S. energy landscape would look like just 6-7 years ago. And this really is a sort of fascinating read, just a really entertaining book to really learn about some of the people who are behind making it happen. So I recommend it to all of you, and I appreciate your being here. So please join me in thanking Greg Zuckerman.